Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Nikki Shafula. I'm here in Toronto, Dish with One Spoon territory. And I'm so excited to be moderating this conversation, storytelling the justice system. Let's welcome our panelists into the room. Hello. Here we have three wonderful artists, and today we're having a conversation that brings together theater makers whose work examines systems of justice. We have Audrey Dwyer, Cole Alvis, and Kim Senclip Harvey, and they're going to be reflecting on the ways in which art can shape, uphold, and subvert narratives about the justice system, and the ways of performance can help us imagine alternatives to the sort of maybe normative systems, and how we can imagine other ways to navigate harm, accountability, and repair on stage and beyond. Yeah, just a quick introduction. These are three prolific artists who I'm sure you all who are watching know. So if you haven't already, spent lots of time just like Googling and getting to know them. But just to highlight some a bit about who they are, Audrey Dwyer is the Associate Artistic Director of the Royal Manitoba Theatre Centre, based in Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory, the Métis homeland. Hi, Audrey.
Hello.
Kim Senclip Harvey is an Indigenous theorist and cultural evolutionist and a member of the Syilx and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Happy to have you here. Hello, Kim.
Hi.
And Cole Alvis is based in Toronto, of Métis, Chippewa, Irish, and English heritage. She is a leader of Lemon Tree Creations, Manidoons Collective, and Ad Hoc Assembly. Welcome, Cole.
Tanse, y'all.
And as I said, I'm here also in Toronto. This land has been stewarded by many people since time immemorial, and importantly is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is a pre-colonial agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe about how to share and care for the land. And as I continue to learn about this treaty and what it means for me, someone who grew up on this land from an Indo-Caribbean family. As I continue to understand it, that treaty, One Dish, One Spoon, invites us to think about how we pass the bowl around, take what we need, but make sure there's enough to go around. And I think that I feel like that has so much resonance in how I want to show up in community, in this industry, and in the world. And I think it invites us to think a lot about accountability. We're all accountable to each other, and making sure that each other has what we need to survive and to thrive. And I think that there's a lot of echoes of what that means when we think about justice. I think a really kind of sweet and perhaps naive interpretation of like the state-sanctioned justice system in Turtle Island and the colonial governments of Canada and the US is that, well, the justice system is a proxy for community, and it's how we hold people accountable when they do wrong. But in practice, these are colonial systems that don't necessarily do that. And so what else, through other sort of community-based methods or otherwise, can we use to live together in healthy what I'm taking with me, from what I'm learning about the land that I'm on into this conversation and to this work. So speaking of work, the artists on this panel have, wide bodies of work that can speak to this theme and are here today to talk about a few of those things. In particular, Audrey is the playwright of Calpurnia and also directed the premiere back in 2018. It's currently running at the Royal Manitoba Theatre Centre and the National Arts Centre. And it explores and critiques Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird and the ways in which that book has sort of helped shape narratives about what the justice system can feel like in popular culture. Cole's going to be talking about a couple works that she's directed, including her interpretation of Michel-Marc Bouchard's Lilies, and also of Toka, which is playing this season with Theatre Passe Muraille and Lemon Tree. And Kim, I think, is going to talk about Break Horizons and the notion of how the stage and screen of justice, which I love that idea of the art being actually a form for justice in itself. And of course, themes of justice show up in all of their work. So maybe to start it off, we can maybe each of you can say a little bit about what's something that catalyzed you to the project or projects in question. What's something that sparked you to jump into it? Audrey, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you, Nikki. Well, Calpurnia came out of a few different ways of working. I was playing a maid in a play, and during a talkback session, um, one of my castmates said that he felt my character was so strong and powerful because my character was completely silent during a racist tirade towards her. And I found that very compelling because silence equaled power. And so I asked my castmate to, dig a little bit deeper about that. And, I asked them where they came up with the idea that silence equaled power, especially when someone who had less power was so silent. And they shared that, they saw that all the time. They saw the maids being silent in like film and television and literature, and that they felt that the maids back then were very quiet. That got me thinking about mammy culture and how um, we've got this stereotype that affirms a kind of silent, docile victim. So I was also a part of a playwriting unit, and I was writing a play that just wasn't going well for me. And so I spoke with a friend named Derek Kwan about what he wanted to see on stage and what excited him. He's an artist that I respect. And so he shared that he wanted to see something that was like political and a play within a play, and that was modern and relevant. And so I started thinking about the books that I had read in high school, and To Kill a Mockingbird was one of those books. We read it a number of times, we studied it, we did projects on it, and I started to think of Calpurnia, the maid in To Kill a Mockingbird, and I thought, okay, maybe I could write a modernized tale about um, a woman who is a maid. And then I tried to complicate it a little bit more. I thought about privilege, wealth, class, Toronto, liberalism, and I came up with a story about a young woman named Julie who comes from a very wealthy and privileged Jamaican Canadian family who wants to write a screenplay about Calpurnia. And because of the many intersectionalities that she lives in, there are certain things that she has yet to uncover. And the play is essentially about how a young Jamaican Canadian woman discovers her politics in real time. And, um, you know, it really just spoke to me, especially considering, the state of the world at that time and how so many people were really discovering their politics around me.
Thanks, Audrey. And it's so interesting to hear you talk about, discovering the sort of what that play meant at that time. And it's still now, it's still so relevant. And, it feels like as the world changes, Calpurnia as a show like continues to be relevant in new ways. So it's great to hear a little bit about your journey to that.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Yeah. Cool. Can I pass it to you?
Absolutely, miigwech. I'm thinking about Lilies, which is also a play within a play, and the ways in which we got to bring and center Indigenous and Black artists within this sort of quintessential queer Canadian classic that's often told with white bodies about people who are incarcerated putting on a play to hold a bishop accountable. And so I suppose one of the things that drew me to this possibility of this interpretation was to get to engage with this text for Black and Indigenous artists to have the opportunity to play these quintessential characters, and also to consider how does Two-Spirit culture participate in this form of justice that the inmates craft themselves, taking advantage of this opportunity to invite the bishop and have the bishop actually arrive and be present for their play, and to consider what the inmates want to see from a place of justice, and how they band together and risk many things within the rules of prison, and certainly detaining this bishop for the duration of the show, but all to seek their own form of justice and to participate together in the crafting of that. Miigwech.
Thanks, Cole. Yeah, that's it's so great to be reminded of your journey to that interpretation, and just how bringing in the like the racial realities of prison really kind of took this already seminal queer text and gave it like particularly strong resonance. And it's nice to hear Audrey and Cole talk about these two processes, with both involve taking seminal works and saying, okay, what does it mean here and now? In the case of Cole's work, through being told through a particular ensemble of Black and Indigenous artists, and then Audrey through the voice of a young artist, a young Black queer character who is coming into her artistic voice and discovering her politics through that. And then Kim, I would love to hear about Break Horizons, which is a form that transcends stage and screen, and in many ways is really trying to bring justice into the, as I understand, the process and the form as well as the content. So I'd love to hear a little about how you came to that idea.
Yeah. Break Horizons was ignited by a CBC report where I heard Indigenous women were the fastest growing population in Canada in the incarcerated systems. When I heard that, it was an ignition. And for me, as a storyteller and a cultural guardian, I was called to pay attention to what was happening here. And the more I researched and the more I looked into what was happening in the Canadian justice system, I was appalled. I learned that Indigenous girls are the fastest growing youth custody population, that 89% of Indigenous women who are currently incarcerated have faced some form of sexual or physical violence, that 40% of Indigenous people in the prison system are survivors of residential schools, and those kind of statistics of intergenerational trauma continued. And so for me, as my work, when you hear about a marginalized or oppressed group or a population, I have a responsibility to speak and give them time to amplify what is going on there for us to pay attention to actually give a sense of justice and enact my own legal order. And so Break Horizons is a rocking Indigenous justice story that actually holds space to switch the paradigm from sort of common civil and state law to an interior Salish plateau legal order. Because when we start thinking about justice, justice is sort of living up to the moral or ethics or fair treatment of a people. But unfortunately, under the state law, that's just not possible for Indigenous people. And that's demonstrated in the over-incarcerated incarceration of Indigenous, Black, and racialized folks. So for me, it was imperative that we use the stage, that we use the practice, that we use the process to assert Indigenous justice for our own fair treatment. And that process continues to evolve to understand how we can have these two legal orders, which is what Canada is. It's a multi-juridical society. Indigenous law does exist with state law, even if the state doesn't want to acknowledge it. And so Break Horizons is this assertion of Indigenous law that they need justice, and the Indigenous women in healing lodges and prisons need to be heard and need to have fair and ethical treatment, which is just not occurring at the state. And so that continues to be the catalyst for me. We just had a screening of the doc at U of A the other day, and for me the process also becomes a form of justice, so that it's a piece to literally hold space for other conversations. I always say, like, my work is just a platform to open up a forum for communion and discourse, and those are just as important as shows or premieres. Being able to hold space with community members and Indigenous people who are being truly oppressed and violated under state Canadian law is the work. It is the most important work, and really is also the impetus and catalyst for me going back to school to get my PhD in law.
Thank you, Kim. It's so rich hearing about your journey to this piece, and I'm thinking about, like, obviously it's so explicitly like abolitionist in its vision, and I think about like Angela Davis saying, making prisons obsolete. It's not the idea of like we're making them obsolete through the supplantation of something else that is richer and better. And I think sometimes when people hear the idea of abolition and they don't have a lot of familiarity with abolition movements, which is this idea of, well, are you asking for anarchy or a lack of ways of holding people accountable when harm happens? When I hear you talk about Break Horizons, I'm hearing you saying, no, we're actually starting with indigenous justice systems. So there's actually forms of justice. They just don't look like the colonial state approach to prisons and police. And so I think that's such a wonderful, like, concrete entry point for maybe those of us who are, searching for, but what else is there when we talk about justice? So that's a great, summary of your project. Thank you.
And there's so many different forms too. Like, I just also want to add, like, it's not about reinventing the wheel. Like, the Scandinavian countries have incredible forms of like rehabilitation centers. And I always find, because I encounter this with so many people when it comes to like justice and judicial reform, but like, what are we just going to let all these horrible people enter the public? It's like, absolutely not. It's not anarchy. There are many forms of justice that live outside the paradigm of state Canadian law. When I look to Indigenous legal orders, like, how do you think we kept peace and survivance and living for so long? We didn't just let anything occur. There are sophisticated systems of justice that have existed for thousands of years, including when I, with my studies, rehearing what you were talking about, the dish with one spoon, which is absolutely a part of their justice system, about sharing, about preventing challenges and conflict, about creating systems of equity within their community. Those are systems of justice that currently exist within our society. We just need to be honoring them and giving them equal weight, and potentially more weight if we're actually talking about decolonial practice and work.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, totally. There's so many examples that we can look at if we just open our eyes to them. I'd love to hear a bit from each of you. On these works that we're talking about. We've got like Calpurnia, which is this like wild, hilarious, comedic, deeply political. Audrey used the word it can be overused, but not like on stage. This reinterpretation of Lilies and that takes this like classic queer work and then like explodes it in a whole other way. Your production, Cole, was I think very respectful of the original work while also totally critiquing it in a way that brought into new space. And then Kim, really speaking directly to like prisons and its impact on Indigenous women and Two-Spirit and like what that means as an ongoing force of colonization. These aren't light, topics or easy topics. And I'm curious about what's a tension that you might have encountered through your work. So maybe that was an internal tension or with a collaborator or with audiences. What's something that comes to mind to you as, oh, this was a tension that I grappled with when working on these projects. Cool. Can we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. Happy to jump in and to acknowledge that Nikki Sheffiula was Associate Director of Lilies and Donna Michelle St. Bernard was our outside eye as well. So many hands supporting this work. And I think a tension that existed, particularly within the creative team, was the introduction of these notions of abolition. And we are casting artists who are at wherever they're at with this this reality and this acknowledgement of colonialism. And so I think while we took the time to be introducing these concepts and connecting them to the narrative of the show, specifically asking the actors to be crafting a backstory of their inmate. The play Lilies is also a film that's fairly well known in the queer community, and yet we were asking the artists to make specific choices about the inmate who we hear the least about. It's mostly the character within the play that they're putting on that are more well known. And so threading abolition into the rehearsal process felt like an important investment of time that we had with the creative team, and being supported by Nikki and Donna Michelle was excellent. I think a tension that arose as we were crafting this is one of the performers is a residential school survivor themselves and therefore has been incarcerated, but largely the cast had not had that lived experience. And so one of the ways that we were providing some of that specificity was through the collaboration with Nikki's collective called Confluence that works specifically with inmates and bringing art to that place. And to be inviting some of the participants from an outreach program that was connected to the project to witness our show, an early rehearsal before tech. And then through this collaboration with Nikki, having that pre-show performance where some of these folks who have lived experiences with the justice system put on a show based on Lilies. And so to be having these worlds come closer together felt important. And towards the tension with the performers, I think there's something that happens when we're talking about abolition that's already been referenced, I suppose, around anarchy and fear. And I think when someone feels that they could be harmed, it can shut down the conversation, or we can have a fear-based response that makes folks no longer brave enough to consider alternatives. And I think that the state and colonialism leverages that fear to maintain the status quo, that anything else is anarchy. And I think that really shuts down the conversation. And I felt that at points in the process when we were taking the time to bring in these values, and perhaps that was causing some discomfort within individuals on the team. And I think that that's a palpable aspect of this conversation that some folks may feel when we engage in these conversations.
Thank you for that, Cole. And I'm just remembering, you sort of walking us through that process and having been in the room for some of that process myself. I remember, it's particularly for Two-Spirit, trans and queer communities who experience violence from people in the world, but also experience violence from the state. That tension was really present in the room, especially kind of in the wake at the time before the production of a very significant set of serial violence that had happened in the community, in the Church Street community, and people were really responding to, like, what do we do without the police when someone like this, a person, is doing this kind of violence, but also when the state is, not supporting either. So that tension was really rife in that process. I'm just, remembering that myself. So thank you for that. Kim, can I pass it over to you if there's a tension from, your process that you... Mm-hmm.
I think that, excuse me, I think the tension that continues to occur is the sort of indictment of us all being participants in a system that is racist, inequitable, and unfair. Having to reckon with that, as we can see when the Black Rebellion occurred, when the Indigenous Land Back movements are happening, the public really struggles with honoring the reality of the systems that we uphold. And in Break Horizons, the shifter kind of flies in the first scene and sort of indicts the whole Long Lodge or the ceremony to say, we are all responsible for this. And the tension really comes from the audience to go, no, not me, or I don't work at a prison, or I don't, I'm an ally. And for me, it's the ability as a player and a creator to push past those insecurities, to push past that kind of conditioning to refute a participation. And that's really hard. I talked to one of my writing mentors, Colleen Murphy, and she always talks about it like writing on a razor blade, where you want to be pushing the audience. We have to be pushing the audience, but we cannot push them away. We want to be moving them. And that continues to be something really challenging. Like, how do we talk about white supremacy? How do we talk about racialized injustice? How do we talk about genocide that is still occurring for Indigenous people, with the apprehension of Indigenous children into the ministries, with the over-incarceration, without non-racialized folks going, not me, because we actually need them. We need them to understand that they participate in our complicit and uphold these systems, just as I do. And I say that to share. It's like, before I started writing this, I really did not have any obstruction to what was happening. I was like, yes, jails, prison systems work. We're all safe. And really not understanding the depths of systemic racism and the tactics that the states have used to really deliberately target Black and Indigenous and racialized folks. And that continues to be something in all of my works that I struggle with, and a tension between. the shame people immediately feel instead of a responsibility to transform. And that's where, for me as an artist, I have to intersect the reality of what we need us to address, but also keep people engaged. And I think that's the role of the artist, is to keep these engaging. We flip the channel. We're not reading these news articles or these statutes of justice or these policies or pieces of legislation. We're just not. And I also feel like that's a tactic of the state, to make law feel so outside of our lives, when really we abide by law and engage with law in every aspect of our life. The moment you get up, you're abiding by law. The moment you step out into the public, you're abiding or not abiding by law. So a part of it is to really figure out, how can audience members feel like they are a participant and authority and have agency to really impact law and legislation and justice. And that's really hard. And so Break becomes this sort of conduit, like why we use rock and roll and humor and radical empathy from these Indigenous femmes and non-binary people inside there to say, let's just all look at this. Let us all figure out how we have created a system that is not equitable. But that will, till opening night, till probably the end of my career, be the largest tension that I deal with, is really addressing our complicity in these systems that are violent.
Heck yeah. I just like feel the like rock and roll when you even talk about it, and just the idea of like how the form of the art can really be a way to navigate that tension, and to not like pretend it's not there, but be like, actually that is, in some of this work, that is the work, is like, how do we do this in a way where we're not alienating, because what do we gain by alienating each other in the conversations. And I also think, Kim, that's such a great segue to talk about Calpurnia. Audrey, I'm so curious to hear what you have to say, because Calpurnia really is a play about tension. It's about the conflicts that happen, and some of the, hearing Kim's answer, some of the tensions she was naming are explicit conversations in Calpurnia. So I'm so curious to hear what your response is to this question.
Yeah, thank you, Nikki, and thank you, Cole and Kim. It's just an honor and a pleasure to hear you two speak about your work. I'm just smiling over here, just like so excited to hear, and just learning so much. Calpurnia is a comedy, and I think as we all know, comedies are rooted in that tension, and it's always been my goal to like ride that fine line, like that same fine line that you mentioned, Kim, that fine razor sharp line of comedy that keep audiences attentive and listening and recognizing themselves through situations and dialogue. And so for me, that was a huge focus of my work, that we're not laughing at, we're laughing with, and we're also checking ourselves all the way through. Considering characters and their process and people and their process, I really try to create folks that were in crisis and were in their own sort of tension. And, I love bringing that to my work, because it also makes me feel tense. And I feel like if I feel tense, the audience too will feel tense. This play is about anti-Black racism, and it's about the tensions of the world that we're all in right now. And so, when it comes to process, as artists work on it, whether they're actors or designers or, producers, they've really got to confront their own anti-Black racism. And, it comes up in so many different ways, depending on what your relationship is with that, So the thing I really love about theater and the beautiful transformational element of theater is that we actually have the time to really dig deep into these themes and to dig deep into ourselves. And, in a kind of like perfect mix, the artists are able to transform and the audiences are able to transform as well, and move forward and grow.
Thank you so much for that, Audrey. I'm really hearing, the value that you mentioned, that time to, in the theater can allow us that time to really, unpack those tensions. And so that's a reminder of like how it's important to have processes that support time to navigate those tensions. And it's so amazing that was possible on Calpurnia, and that's really evident in the work as well. So I want to ask another question. Reflecting on your journeys through these various pieces, if there was like a moment that stands out as kind of like an aha moment where you found yourself accessing a new idea or a new piece of learning even within the work, maybe it was when you were working independently or when you were in the room with collaborators or out in the world with audiences. But yeah, is there something that sort of stands out to you as kind of like, oh yeah, this was like a moment where something shifted for me? Kim, maybe we can start with you.
Break continues to be probably one of the most challenging pieces artistic ceremonies that I'm working on. It challenges institutions to have to address many aspects of white supremacy in their organizations, which is very challenging for many, and some just don't want to do, or they don't have the capacity to navigate. And so honoring also just even the scope of this piece. It's a really large show. Break Horizons has a cast of 6, a full band on stage. It's a whole world that we're building. And it's still, in terms of our own notions of justice in this country, it is very hard for Indigenous theater to put on large-scale productions in the state. Even when I look at Kamloopa, it took 5 companies to produce that show. And that was, I would say, a smaller to mid-sized show itself. But in terms of really understanding my own impulse and need, was working with the women in the Healing Lodge, was visiting people who are incarcerated, was being a ministry worker who worked in the Ministry of Children and Family Care, predominantly with foster kids, and also seeing the need for legal orders to have a resurgence within our own peoples. I live in downtown Vancouver, I live close to the downtown east side, and I'm reminded of my work as a cultural guardian and steward for justice often. But I think with particular focus on Break Horizons, what really motivates me was after the documentary premiere, the DMs that I've received from Indigenous and racialized families who go, oh my God, thank you for talking about this. Nobody is talking about that my auntie is locked up, that my grandma is locked up, that my cousin is locked up. I'm ashamed that this is happening. And this revealing of the awful treatment of Indigenous families intergenerationally, just the fact that we are not talking about this, and there is so much shame about the incarceration system, about adults who have been incarcerated and adults who are no longer incarcerated, and that for them, they just express this deep relief that it helped them feel normalized to be able to share what had happened to them. Most recently, I was talking to someone who talked about the fact that they had really never shared with anyone that they had been incarcerated before. And they now have a position that they're just living a normal life, and these ability for the public to understand and hear that these people, when I go into those healing lodges, it's like they're bead workers, they're philosophers, they're matriarchs, they're our cousins, they're home care facilitators, they're stewards of the land, and that they are people. Like, I just feel like the way the media has portrayed people incarcerated has been so deplorable and so shame-ridden, that I think for me, that continues to be the biggest ignition, that for them to have a chance at a just and merciful life, at a life of rehabilitation and of transformation, is to hold space around the conversation around these really problematic and complex ways as to how they ended up in the prison system. And honestly, I can share that I have not met or read a report about a single person who's been in prison who has not experienced trauma to some deep capacity. And I'm talking about Indigenous, Black, non-Indigenous, everybody. To me, what really is shocking and deliberate by the state is that they have found a way to criminalize and weaponize the trauma that they inflict on racialized folks. How is it that they send people to genocide schools and then, because of the troubles they face from that, be incarcerated from that instance of genocide? That in itself is a crime against all of our humanity. And that, to me, hearing about those stories, hearing about how they just keep getting sucked into these state systems of oppression, continues to ignite and make me work hard for the story to be told, because there are too many of our kin who are locked up right now who need our deep attention and rigorous work.
I'm really here. Thank you for that, Kim. And like, it's sometimes in the theater world, and Cole mentioned this a bit too, the professional arts industry, also academia, where there can be lots of conversations about justice, sometimes for various reasons, including class. There can be a separation from other parts of society where there's a more immediate relationships with people that have lived experience of criminalization and incarceration. And so, Kim, hearing about your work, reminds us, that we really need to be integrated in these conversations, and to hear, you having that feedback. And yeah, I was gonna pass it over to Audrey. Calpurnia's had this amazing long journey, and I'm sure you've had many aha moments working on it. And I'd love to hear about one that's resonating for you in this conversation.
Well, an aha moment that really touched me and continues to be a touchstone for me is the discovery that for Black women, it's really not our responsibility to teach others to not be racist. That was a huge one for me because I was really taught that it was my responsibility to teach everyone. And not only to just teach everyone, to teach people after they've directly hurt my feelings, which is, I think, something that I still wrangle with today. It's an ongoing lesson. And I really feel like, amongst, some of my friends and my family, I can see that it is an ongoing lesson that, racialized folks have also been taught that as they suffer from racism in a myriad of different ways, that it's their direct responsibility to, in the moment, not take care of themselves, not check in with themselves, not even, take a moment or process the things that come up, whether it's sadness, anger, fear, shock, but that it is our responsibility to teach the people that are hurting us not to hurt us. And what's more is to do it in a very gentle and kind and a loving way, really siphoning off our own feelings and impulse and saving that for another time, and making sure that the folks who have done harm are okay. And, I had to put it in the play. I had to have Mark, Julie's brother, say, "You didn't create racism, so why do you think you have to solve it?" And I throw that question up in the air, and it really lands on folks' ears in many different ways. I know folks were saying, "Well, did I create racism? Does that mean I have to solve it?" And for other folks, they're like, "Huh, well, I didn't create racism. Who did? Oh, what? What am I?" And that was a major aha moment for me because I was like, "Oh, I can actually take a lot of that energy and put it towards a million other things." That's just like one of the aha moments I had over the many years of development. What's really lovely about the work of an artist, and as Kim and Cole have shared, is that it's just so deep and ongoing and impactful, and it shifts and changes over the years and throughout a process. It's really a gift.
Thank you so much, Audrey. That's really important to hear about your own journey around taking care of yourself throughout those conversations that obviously become repetitive and exhausting. And to hear you talk about exploring that relationship between how much of this labor is yours to do as a collaborator and as an artist, speaking to other people in the room, and out to the world. And it's amazing to hear, dramaturgically how you took that experience and put it back into the art, which is just extraordinarily generous. And, knowing the show, really enriched it. I think it's also really, what you're saying is a really important reminder to be mindful of our own feelings within any of these conversations. Even in this conversation, the four of us on this call, anybody watching might be having their own range of experiences around grief or anger, etc. So, Cole, I'd love to hear from you about what's ahaing for you in any of the work you're working on.
Miigwech, I will speak about Toka, which is by Indrek Kasapi. It means land in Albanian. And it speaks about the Jukmaria, which is a traditional custom of blood taking It is a form of justice that exists in the mountains of northern Albania today, and is also called a blood cycle. And what happens here is a family that is involved in this process will have permission from the community within the kanun, within the values that have been set up, to murder someone from the other family. And this is the deterrent process that is in place, because then that family then takes revenge on the first family. And this is a cycle that continues on and on. And I'm thinking about the ways in which we understand, or I'm learning about this custom in Albania, and then rethinking the ways in which we here on Turtle Island pay the police to enact that violence for us, as opposed to it being someone within our family that takes on that responsibility. And wanting to be clear about framing police as violence, particularly because of the ways that Black and Indigenous and other communities are over-surveilled and therefore over-incarcerated. And so I guess I'm interested in how we are invisibilizing that process, particularly when looking at Jakmaria, where the entire family is involved and it's very present, and it's next door. It's the next mountain over. It's very close and local. Whereas the penal system here removes folks from our sight, from our imaginations. And I think that invisibilizing is an intentional and crucial structure, so that this ongoing violence can continue unquestioned, because the bulk of the population are not seeing these actions. And so continuing to think about the responsibility of enacting justice family to family versus outsourcing it to a state-run institution that we know is disproportionately impacting certain communities over others, all while we can look the other way or enjoy not having to see it, and therefore engage with the aspects of it that are real and violent. End of thought.
Yeah, that swept under the ruggedness of it is such an important thing to highlight. And also cool what I'm hearing in you talking about, Toka, is this like this kind of like, I think abolitionist critique of the way that North American justice systems work, where people who have experienced harm don't actually get a say in how things are resolved. And Kim talked about other approaches, restorative justice approaches where that is more possible. And so, hearing you frame Toka in that way as a story of like alternative justice systems that are family based is I think super fascinating, and also invites me to think about like where are examples of other kinds of justice that exist that we maybe don't recognize as that. In different culturally, like in the mountains of Albania and also beyond. So that's lots to think about there. So as we're thinking about other stories, I'm wondering if folks have an offering that they'd like to share with everyone about another storyteller, or maybe it's another piece of art or theater that has shaped your thinking about the justice system or has impacted your own analysis, maybe the other works you discussed. A work you'd like to highlight or platform.
I can jump in to respond to the prompt of another storyteller that sort of reframes justice for me, and it's on Instagram, and it's Raven Wings, an abolitionist, an artist, an incredible Afro-Indigenous person who's a member of Black Lives Matter Toronto, and is on Instagram Live frequently sharing music, spirit, words, story. And I highly encourage you all to tune in. If you can. She's gorgeous and exceptional, and is sharing things that need to be heard right now.
Raven Wings, thank you for that, Cole. Audrey.
I can share that, two things. Calpurnia was really inspired by To Kill a Mockingbird, and the one of the main themes in that book is justice and looking at the justice system that tried an innocent Black man of assault as guilty when he was innocent, and that sort of led me to looking at how enslavement and the police force and the justice system, judges, lawyers, how all of that is intertwined through history and stays with us today. And so, in my work, I make the father and son of the story, Lawrence and Mark, employees in the legal system. Lawrence is the father, he's the judge, and he was a former lawyer. Mark is a criminal defense lawyer, and Mark is really discovering his politics as well, wanting to move towards legal aid. For me, I really wanted to show people in motion and movement as their politics are challenged and how they grow. But a film that really stood out to me and inspired me during that time was by Ava DuVernay, and it was the Central Park 5 story. The film is called When They See Us. And for me, one of the highlights of that film is when a father of one of the Central Park 5, again, a number of Black communities in New York dealing with the crisis around a jogger being sexually assaulted, and these 5 young men who are tried and convicted of that crime and also innocent. One of the young men's father, he actually encourages him to lie, and I teared up. And it's that kind of work that really inspires me, because the system is not working. And if a son and father have to connect through lying in order to save themselves, and it still doesn't work, that was just a clear example to me how fractured the system is, and how I can layer that into my play.
So palpable, the fracture of the system, in that way, and really evident in how you've used that relationship in Calpurnia. Thank you. Kim, is there something you'd like to share? Something that's coming up for you?
Yeah, I think for me, the first instance of really inspiration continues to be the people who are on the front lines and who are facing the over incarceration. But that can be really overwhelming to think, who am I to help change a system, and to really interrogate my own indoctrination that I can't participate. And then when I looked around to other people who are at the extreme of really impacting judicial reform, I think of this man, a lawyer in America named Brian Stevenson, and he founded the Equal Justice Institute, and he works on death row and helps people who were wrongly accused or faced really problematic accusations and charges to get off. And he's helped him and the Social Justice Institute have helped over 135 people get off of death row, and then hundreds more to have their sentences relooked at. He's a lawyer, he's an activist, and then they made a movie from his memoir called Just Mercy, which I believe you can stream on Canadian Netflix right now, that I profoundly impacted me. I don't think I've ever wept as intensely in a movie before. I don't think I've ever admired and humbly been a witness to a work of a man who, in every circumstance, believes and invests in his own ability to change a system designed for the incarceration and death of Black people, particularly in the States. And also the fortitude of the Black and racialized folks who are currently all sitting on death row in the States today.
Thank you so much, Kim, for that. Just Mercy, this movie that you can watch about this story and this struggle to, intervene in capital punishment and people who are wrongfully accused or otherwise on death row. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing about those offerings. As we're approaching the end of our time together, I'm really curious to hear, and you've already sort of, people have been talking about this, the ways in which, your work and your exploration around these ideas of justice show up in the actual interpersonal ways that you work, and you work with your colleagues, and treat the people around you. And I find that really inspiring, and so would love to hear an offering about a way in which your thinking about justice actually shows up, not just in the content of your work, but in the process of it. So something that you offer into the artistic spaces that you create.
I could jump in to say how abolition informs my process creatively in regards to Manadoons Collective, which I run with Yolanda Banal. We're thinking about the central principle of, or to me, a central principle of abolition is to do less harm. And so when thinking about the process of how we work, moving towards shorter days and to be engaged with an ongoing conversation with technicians and with our most recent collaboration, Buddies in Bad Times Theater, around how we can adjust Tech Week to provide more care for the entire creative team involved. Tech Week is a period of time where the days can go from 8 hours to 12 hours for multiple days, and that's permitted. And while it is permitted, is this the best way to provide care? And so I think moving towards that principle does have actionable things that require us to generate new ways of working that moves away from a structure that, while it has been permitted from whatever powers may be, moving away from the harm that's possible and likely in some of those structures and moving towards care. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Cole. It's so great to hear about the work you and Manadoons do. Audrey, can we hear from you?
Yeah. As a playwright, I've been able to work with the NAC in part of their investor series. And so I had the opportunity to workshop the play over many years. And, I was always taught that in order to write a play, you had to, go for the jugular and like load your characters up with all of these different kinds of obstacles and create an experience that was like frenetic and challenging for the actor. And I have to say that through these workshops, I've really learned a lot about how to reduce harm within the text and to not make, edgy, hard choices just for the sake of drama. That, if I can make a choice that's at a 10 or an 8 or a 5 or even a 2, that can be edgy enough. I started to see how some of these characters were working with the text, primarily the Black folks that had to do extremely hard things, and I just pulled it out and found different ways to have the same kind of moment, but that weren't as intense, and that didn't mean that the actor had to go home and struggle with some of the things that were asked of them on stage. So, I've learned a lot about how to write plays that send certain messages across, but that, take care of an actor who has to, rehearse it for 3 weeks and then perform it for maybe 4, sometimes 8 weeks. Thanks for asking that question. It's a great one.
Thank you so much, Audrey. It's amazing to hear about how you take care of artists as a playwright, like really starting even just from the art itself. And Kim, I'd love to hear from you. Yeah, if there's an offering you'd like to share about some of the ways that you enter into process.
Yeah, for me, I think one of the largest sort of internalized reflexive modes of justice we could do within the theater system is really troubling the notion of how theater gets made under the Canadian state with regards to who's in charge, who's leading these institutions, what are their metrics for equity and anti-colonial practice. Because for me, I'm really, as we start to head back to theater, in a mode of like, we can't go back. We cannot go back to the way that theaters were run, the way that artists were treated, the way that plays were truly underdeveloped, and that it's so amazing to hear the resources, Audrey, that were given to this incredible story, but that shouldn't be rare. that should not just happen at the National Arts Center, that plays all across these nations should be invested in, and to really look at how funding models in this country have prioritized white leaders, white institutions, white organizations, and white collectives for Indigenous, Black, and racialized and marginalized communities to have to self-produce, scramble to get companies to help support and give big works at the same equitable level that shows like Mamma Mia and Mary Poppins get. And I think that needs to deeply troubled in this in the sector, specifically with regards to how organizations are implicitly and almost inherently white supremacist, and how that positions racialized artists to have to challenge and be positioned to confront areas and ways of working that are not designed for our safety, that are not designed for our justice, that are not designed for our modes of making and ontologies. And until the theater sector really reckons with that, I think we're all complicit in obstructing justice and stories of justice outside of a white supremacist common state law lens, and that's problematic. I don't hear enough conversations going on right now that aren't led by racialized leaders talking about how we can have better working environments. I don't see policy and legislation and rehearsal practices being led by white leaders. I hear independent racialized artists demanding better, and organizations sort of adapting beyond that, and that's a lot of labor. That's a lot of labor that a lot of artists pick up and is going uncompensated for. And that needs a big discussion. And I would like to just focus on writing and doing the work. And yet I find a lot of my time is focused on having to confront the racialized experience of trying to write a play in this country.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you, the three of you. Like your offerings around care and bringing justice into the process, I think really like work together well as we hear like how we do that as an artist supporting our fellow artists. Stepping into hard stories as producers. How we it's really a gift to hear your perspective in concert here and really tell a story about like how you as artists and your collaborators are really creating new paths forward for everyone as we sort of participate in stories as audience and also as artists, it's sort of working in the sector, trying to with culture in meaningful ways. So I want to thank you all so much for bringing your wisdom to this room. You're like you've all referenced the communities you work with, and I know that that's so important that we hold that up in this sort of individualistic society. And also I wanted to celebrate the three of you, your amazing bodies of work, and also your brains and your hearts in this conversation. So so Audrey, Kim, and Cole, much gratitude. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.